Hi. I'd like to talk about why teaching social studies and other content is teaching reading. Over the past several decades, we've spent enormous amounts of time and money trying to improve students' reading outcomes, but we've made virtually no progress. Scores on national reading tests have been stagnant, with only about a third of students reaching proficient or above. In 2019, scores actually declined, and the gap between high and low scorers got wider. At the same time, scores on national tests in civics, geography, and U.S. history are even worse. Only about a quarter of 8th graders score proficient or above on civics and geography tests. And on the most recent tests, only 15% cleared the proficiency bar in U.S. history, down from 18% 2 years before. And there are large gaps between student subgroups there as well. Now, these things are actually connected. We've basically stopped teaching social studies in elementary school in order to spend more time on reading and math in an effort to boost test scores. And that's especially true in schools where scores are low. But evidence from cognitive science tells us that we've been undermining our own efforts. If we want to boost reading scores, and scores in civics, geography, and history, we should be spending more time on social studies, not less. To understand why, we need to first look at the standard approach to teaching reading comprehension. The emphasis is on comprehension skills and strategies, like finding the main idea or making inferences. Now, that didn't start with high-stakes testing, but the tests have led schools to double down on teaching these skills because reading tests appear to measure them. Usually, the teacher will demonstrate a skill of the week, and students will practice the skill on books at their individual reading levels, which could be years below their grade levels. The topics of the books aren't considered important. It might be clouds one day, zebras the next. The point is not for students to acquire any particular knowledge, but to master the skills. And the theory is that once you've gotten good at finding the main idea, you'll be able to apply that skill to understand pretty much any text that's put in front of you, whether it's a passage on an end-of-the-year reading test or a high school textbook like a world history textbook in high school. But cognitive psychologists have long known that reading comprehension doesn't actually work that way. They've found that the most important factor isn't skill, it's how much the readers know about the topic. So, if we want to boost reading comprehension, we need to start building kids' knowledge in social studies and other substantive areas as early as possible. Now, like any writing, passages on standardized reading tests make certain assumptions about what the reader already knows. And they don't cover anything students have learned in school. In fact, they're designed not to because the idea is to test skills rather than knowledge. But if you don't have enough prior knowledge to understand the text, you don't get a chance to demonstrate your ability to find the main idea or make inferences. So these reading tests end up being tests of general knowledge. For example, here's a released item from a 3rd grade reading test. In one of the most remote places in the world, the Canadian Arctic, a people have survived over 1,000 years. They are the Inuit. For the Inuit, the Arctic is a place teeming with life. Depending on how far north they live, the Inuit find everything from caribou herds and polar bears to beluga whales. Now, that might seem straightforward, but here's that same paragraph without the words and phrases many 3rd graders won't know. Now, of course, some 3rd graders will know those words, probably because they've picked them up at home. They tend to be the students from more highly educated families. The others depend on school for that kind of knowledge, and because of the intense focus on comprehension skills, they're unlikely to get it there. And that explains a lot of the gap in scores between haves and have-nots. The kind of knowledge needed to understand that passage on the Inuit could be acquired through social studies, but not the typical early elementary social studies curriculum, which focuses on mundane topics like all about me and my community, often through 3rd or 4th grade. So unless you're a 3rd grader living in an Inuit community, that curriculum won't help you with the reading passage you just saw. Now, this approach to social studies rests on the theory that young children can't grasp or won't be interested in topics that are remote from their own experience. But there's no evidence to support that. And I've seen children become fascinated by those kinds of topics if they're presented in an engaging way. And if we want students to understand history and geography later on, we need to introduce those concepts in the early grades. But especially in schools where test scores are low, the narrow focus on reading and math often continues through middle school. So by the time students get to high school, the gaps in knowledge between haves and have-nots can be huge. That's because prior knowledge of the topic doesn't just help you understand what you read, it also helps you absorb and retain new information. So kids who start out with more academic knowledge, because they've picked it up outside school, are better able to understand more complex text and acquire new knowledge from it, which in turn equips them to understand yet more complex text. But kids who start out with less academic knowledge in our leveled reading system are restricted to simpler text and are less likely to be able to acquire new knowledge. And so every year that goes by, the gap in academic knowledge between the two groups gets wider and harder to narrow. And there's another kind of gap that becomes painfully obvious in high school, the gap between what we assume students know and what many actually do know. Teachers in high-poverty high schools have told me it's not unusual for them to have students who don't know the difference between a city and a state, or a country and a continent, or can't find the United States on a map of the world, or their hometown on a map of the United States, and who lack a sense of historical chronology. It's not that they can't learn these things, it's just that no one has taught them these things. And yet, they're expected to read and understand, for example, a textbook on world history. We're holding kids responsible for knowledge we've withheld from them, and that's not fair. Now, the best solution to this problem is for schools to adopt elementary curricula that focus on building knowledge in history, geography, and science. And in the last several years, a number of such curricula have been developed, and more schools are adopting them. But if students haven't been exposed to that kind of curriculum in elementary school, as many have not, all is not lost. It's harder to compensate for knowledge gaps at upper grade levels, but it's definitely not impossible. The most effective approach is through writing instruction. Writing is potentially an extremely powerful lever for building knowledge and filling in gaps in knowledge if instruction is grounded in the content of the curriculum and not just English. Social studies is actually a particularly powerful subject in which to embed writing activities. But there's an important caveat. Writing is also the most difficult thing we ask students to do. And if inexperienced writers are asked to write at length, they may be juggling so many things, everything from spelling to word choice to organization, that they simply won't have the cognitive capacity available to think about, analyze, and retain any content. The solution is to begin writing instruction at the sentence level, using a method like the writing revolution. Now, the method doesn't end at the sentence level, it goes all the way through argumentative essays, but it's important to begin with sentences if that's what students need. And even many high school students haven't mastered the art of constructing a good sentence. To give you a taste of what this method entails, let's look at an activity called Because, But, and So. Let's say you're teaching about the presidency of Andrew Jackson. You might give students the following sentence stems. Andrew Jackson was a popular president because, but, and so. This activity not only explicitly teaches students to learn how to use conjunctions, sometimes something that many students don't just pick up, it also requires them to recall what they've learned, analyze it in different ways, and explain it in their own words. Another powerful writing revolution activity involves appositives. Those are phrases that describe nouns. Here are some examples embedded in content about ancient Greece, like a Greek city-state, Athens, a Greek city-state, valued education and democracy. Now, this kind of instruction should begin in elementary school, but that's only possible if there's enough content in the curriculum to give students something to write about. So, a content-focused curriculum, rich in information about history and geography as well as science, is the first step in building knowledge. For too long, our efforts to equip students to succeed on reading tests have only been setting them up for failure, not just on end-of-the-year tests, but in high school and beyond. We can change that by recognizing that teaching social studies and science and other content-rich subjects is teaching reading, and by exploiting the power of writing to build and deepen knowledge.